Hey everybody, we are moving on to a new unit and a new chapter, and we're going to be looking at descent with modification, and we're looking at Darwin and his view of life. So, how did the diversity of life originate? That is a question that people have been asking for a long time, and we've known the answer for quite a while, and it's through the process of evolution. Evolution says that the processes that have transformed life on Earth from its beginnings to today's diversity, and it explains how that happens. This is the most pervasive principle in biology. And as we get started talking about it, we need to talk about the theory of evolution through natural selection, and we need to understand what theory means in science. So, in science, this is a hypothesis that's supported repeatedly by data. It makes testable predictions. All right, so this is something that has been tested widely and supported over and over and over again. Okay, so other examples of theories in science, we have the cell theory, which we talked about in the beginning of the year, Big Bang theory, atomic theory, theory of gravity, and then theory of evolution. Okay, so evolution has itself evolved or changed over time, and it actually is a really good illustration of science as a process. And so you should be able to give main points of several different views that we're about to talk about on how the idea of life on Earth and how it changed, how that actually evolved over time. So there are five main pre-Darwinian views that we're going to take a look at. We're going to look at what the Greeks thought. We're going to look at the fixed species idea, catastrophism, Hutton and Lyell, and then Lamarck. So the Greek philosophers, mainly Plato and Aristotle, Plato said that organisms are already perfectly adapted to their environments, and Aristotle thought that organisms are arranged on a scale of life, from simple to complex. But either way, neither one of them talked about evolution. Essentially, what they were saying is that life is already perfect, so it doesn't need to change, and that all rungs on life's ladder are already occupied, and that they're occupied in an order from simple to complex, that it was all just perfectly arranged. Then there's the fixed species concept, and this says that the creator had designed each and every species for a particular purpose, and so because of that, there was no evolution. And this created the viewpoint that all species could be identified and named, which is actually was really important for the field of taxonomy, and how we went about naming and classifying all living things. Then catastrophism, this was George Cuvier, and he attempted to relate fossils to current life on Earth. So his theory were that fossils were the remains of species lost due to catastrophe. He didn't think, though, that new species ever originated. He only said that species could be lost over time. And so the result here was that evolution still wasn't occurring in his eyes. He thought that the Earth started out with way more species than were alive when he was, and that fossils that were found were evidence that other species had died, but there was no new species being formed. Then we have James Hutton, and he talked about gradualism. And this says that profound change is the cumulative product of slow but continuous processes. And so essentially, he said that changes on Earth are gradual; they're not catastrophic. And so the example here would be the Grand Canyon. That this is a gradual process that happened over years and years and thousands and millions of years of water wearing away at the rock, as opposed to some one single catastrophic event. We have Charles Lyell, and he incorporated Hutton's gradualism into a theory called uniformitarianism. Okay, it's a mouthful. And what this says is that geological processes have operated at the same rate over Earth's history. And so here you've got a diagram. In the first part, you have rivers bringing sediment to the ocean. You have sedimentary rocks containing fossils that then form on the ocean floor. Over time, you're going to have additional strata or layers that are added that contain fossils from each time period. And so then as sea levels change and eventually the sea floor is pushed upward, sedimentary rocks are exposed, and then erosion by rivers reveals the strata, and so the older strata are going to contain the older fossils. So this is a really huge idea when you get into anthropology and things like archaeology, that when you're digging in an area, generally the older fossils are going to be towards the bottom in the older strata or the older layers. So the result was then that the Earth must be very old. At that point in time, most people believed that it was about 6,000 years old based on, the Bible and the fixed species concept. This showed, though, that it's very slow, subtle processes that can cause these huge, substantial changes on Earth. Then we have a guy who's fairly important to the idea of evolution, even though he didn't get it quite right. So this is Lamarck, and he published his theory in 1809, and his theory was that life changed from simple to complex over time. And so he thought that fossils were the remains of past life forms, and he did say that evolution occurred. It's his mechanism of evolution, however, that was incorrect. He talked about use and disuse, that body parts that were used to survive would become larger and stronger, and that body parts that were not used to survive would deteriorate. So that's where we get the whole like use it or lose it kind of idea. He also talked about acquired characteristics. So these would be modifications that were acquired by use and disuse, but he thought that those modifications were then passed on to offspring. So my example for this is a bodybuilder. So somebody can be a professional bodybuilder and develop these huge, massive muscles, right? But those muscles are not going to be passed on to a child. He may have the genes that help make muscles larger. He may be more predisposed to being able to work out and get larger muscles. But just because this bodybuilder has been working hard for all these years and developed these huge muscles, these huge biceps, a little baby's not going to pop out with, you know, massive biceps. So you cannot pass on acquired characteristics. One of the major problems with Lamarck's theory was that there was no knowledge of genetics. And because of that, we now know that acquired traits are not transmitted to offspring. The only thing that can be transmitted to offspring are genes. So again, I said that bodybuilder maybe has genes that makes him more predisposed to putting on muscle mass quickly. He could pass those genes onto his offspring, but he couldn't actually, you know, pass on the like huge muscles that he's gotten after years of working out. So like I said, Lamarck definitely deserves credit for his work. He did suggest correctly the role of fossils in evolution. He did suggest that adaptation to the environment is a primary product of evolution. Okay, so he did do a few things right here. Then we have Thomas Malthus. And in 1798, he wrote an essay on population growth. He talked about things like disease, famine, homelessness, and war. He said they're inescapable because human populations are essentially growing faster than food supplies are growing. So this was a really key idea. Darwin read this essay, and it very much influenced him. So Charles Darwin is the father of modern theory of evolution, and his theory is descent with modification. So his background is that he was actually a naturalist after trying religion and medicine. So he sailed around the world on a ship called the Beagle. And so you can see leaving from Europe, heading down to the southern hemisphere, kind of bouncing around South America, and then back up north on the west coast of South America. A very key stop at the Galapagos Islands, which we'll talk about in the future. And then around down Australia, New Zealand, around the Cape of Good Hope in Africa, back to South America, and then back up to Europe. So the result is that Darwin's training and travel opportunities allowed him to formulate and support his ideas on natural selection. So he had lots of data on this. A really good example that we'll spend a lot of time talking about are the Galapagos finches, so birds that he found on those Galapagos Islands. But he was not the only one to talk about evolution in the way that he did. Alfred Wallace wrote a paper on natural selection, and it was essentially identical to Darwin's ideas. So on July 1st, 1858, there was a dual presentation of the Wallace-Darwin ideas to the Linnean Society of London. And in 1859, Darwin published The Origin of Species, which was his book describing how natural selection occurred. So I know I haven't gone into a ton of detail on Darwin and Wallace yet, but based on some of the things that I did say, I would like you guys to answer the question that if both Darwin and Wallace presented on natural selection, why do you think Darwin is more famous for the work? So I talked about a couple things pretty specifically that he did in this lecture, so I'd like you guys to kind of think about it and send me an email with the answer. All right, thanks. Bye.